Welcome to the very first episode of Knee of the Curve podcast. If you're a fan of the show, you know I've done some interviews before, but now the podcast is going to have its own thing separate from the desk pieces. So now you get to watch the conversation in its entirety. And these will be available on all the podcast places. So if you want to listen on Spotify or iTunes or whatever, you can find them there as well. I am super excited about this first guest. He is a technology futurist, a geopolitical expert, a social entrepreneur, and a sci-fi novelist. He wrote a great book that I loved called Hacking Darwin, all about genetic engineering and what we can and cannot do now and in the near future. And that's what we talk about, what we can do, what we should and shouldn't do, and what this all means for humanity in the future. So with that, please enjoy my conversation with Jamie Metzl. Welcome to the show, Jamie.
Thanks so much.
How did you get so passionate about biotech and genetic engineering and how this is, going to affect our future?
So in the 90s, I was working in the Clinton administration, and my then boss and now close friend, Richard Clark, in those days was talking about the threat of Al-Qaeda and terrorism, and nobody would listen. And Dick, of course, was later proven very prescient and sadly Cassandra-like when 9/11 happened and all of the warnings that he had given hadn't been heeded. And Dick always used to say that if everyone in Washington was focusing on one thing, the most important thing that you could do would be to think differently, to focus on something else that you thought was the most important thing. And the more I looked around and the more I learned, I came to believe with ever greater conviction that the genetics and biotech revolutions were going to fundamentally transform our world and our lives. And I started educating myself. And when I was ready, started writing articles, was invited to testify before Congress on these issues, gave a lot of talks. And then I realized that I wasn't reaching people in the way that I wanted to. And that was why I wrote my two science fiction novels, Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata, to try to tell the story of the genetics revolution as a story in a way that people could really absorb. And when I was on book tours for those novels, describing the science and its implications in my way, as someone who was self-taught in the sciences, I could see in people's eyes that they were getting it. They were realizing that there was a big story happening and that they were part of it and it was meaningful for them. And that was when I realized that I needed to write the book, the story of the genetics revolution, past, present, and future. And that's Hacking Darwin. And that process has brought me deeply into so many different areas, including now being a member of the World Health Organization International Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing, where we're trying to at least imagine what should be the rules for guiding some of the most powerful technologies in human history.
Awesome. So before we get into what those rules are, I want to jump back quickly to Hacking Darwin and ask you, what do you think got the message across better, the fiction or the nonfiction?
Well, they're both. I mean, we are humans. The way that we learn is by hearing stories, telling stories. That's the way our brains are organized. And that's why most people don't read dry scientific journals or biology textbooks. They read stories. And so writing fiction about science is very closely aligned with writing nonfiction that is telling a story. And I think it's one of my critiques of a lot of writing about all kinds of issues, not just science, but science, economics, politics. This stuff is so interesting. It's so transformative. And to do it well, we need to bring people into those stories. So I think it's not really an either or because they're both so intimately connected to each other.
I ask because, this is a comedy show and we don't do political news as a focus. We
Right.
do news on the crazy future that's sort of, was liken it to a tidal wave that's coming at us. And whether you like it or not, you're going to get hit with this wave. So, there's a little gallows humor in that. And so there is this, I try to walk the line between this, is it fear mongering, that I'm because there's a lot of comedy and fear. There's tension, and when you release tension, you get it, or excitement, and that's probably a balance that you have to face quite a bit as well.
Yeah, so all of these technologies can be used or misused. There is a great story of how, whether it's the tools of the genetics revolution or AI or nanotechnology and so many other things, they can be used to enhance our lives in so many different ways, to cure and prevent diseases, to keep us from getting in terrible car accidents. And they can all be abused in terrible ways. And so if someone is just telling a positive story or just telling a negative story, they're doing a disservice. And it's also disempowering for people, because if you feel that the future is inevitably good or inevitably bad, what role do you have, or does anyone have, in shaping it? But in at least in the world as I see, we don't know that future. We know that there are potentials in both directions, and everybody has a really important role to play in making sure that we can optimize the good stuff and minimize the bad stuff.
So let's talk about what this stuff actually is, the nitty gritty. Like, what is the big idea? I mean, it's changing what it means to be even human at the basic level, right?
Well, I wouldn't say that's. I mean, at the basic level, I mean, it may be going there. It probably is going there over time. But at its core, the main message is that our one little species among the billions that live and have ever lived, we suddenly have the ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. And that's going to have huge implications on the way we do healthcare, on the way we think about energy and consumer products and food and manufacturing and so many other things. And the sophistication of these tools and capabilities is only going to increase over time. And it is over time going to change what it means to be a human being. Just like harnessing fire and steam and cities and so many other things have changed what it means to be a human being. And itself, what it means to be a human being is a moving target. We've only been this for 300,000 years. Even if we didn't have any of these technologies, this was never going to be the end point of our evolutionary journey as a species.
Right. I think sometimes there's a blend between what's scary and what's really exciting. Like for me, I get really excited by the idea that I loved your conversation with Eric Weinstein when you guys talked about a Cambrian explosion in diversity for humanity. And I've mentioned a few things on my show where it's like, all the aliens in sci-fi movies, or it won't be aliens, they'll be options. You'll be kind of able to design yourself into, and I think that's really exciting to me, but some people would probably find that completely frightening.
Well, the world around us keeps getting reset. And so, during the time of the dinosaurs, that was normal. Having a bunch of humans driving around with jet fighters able to drop nuclear weapons, that would have been outside of their frame of reference. Yes, the world is going to change. Yes, our species is driving that change and will almost certainly continue to do it. And it really is insane from a historical perspective, because there are lots of other species on the planet. We're the only one with the capacity to fundamentally transform or even end all of life on Earth. And it's a great power, and like Spider-Man's, I guess, uncle says, it comes with great responsibility.
And I'm interested in what rules you guys are talking about, trying to sort of conceive of, and how you're going to go about helping advance the technology so that we get all of the good, and none of the bad, obviously, right? Yeah. We don't want to slow down our progress for the good.
So first, I certainly am a big supporter of scientific advancement. I think it should not be that our strategy for avoiding bad stuff is slowing down scientific progress. What we need to do is to make sure that we're in a world where we optimize the benefits and minimize the harms. And that brings us to the kind of unsexy word of governance. And when people think of governance, maybe it's like one person or one ruler saying, all right, here's the rule. But in fact, governance, especially for technologies, happens on so many different levels, not just different levels of government, but people are working in universities that have rules, hospitals have rules. And so we need to think holistically. But at the end of the day, everything has to be anchored in a set of values of what do we need, and certainly ideas of inherent human rights, ideas that it's not okay to experiment on other humans, which is certainly what I believe the Chinese scientist He Jiankui was doing when they genetically altered the 3 Chinese babies in 2018 and 2019. We have to define.
I'd like to understand. There's obviously some reasons why that was immoral. So I'd like to understand those, because obviously when they first came out with it, it was, hey, we're doing this to give these kids a better life or protect them. But there was some other aspects of it that could have been sort of bad, right?
Well, I don't know whether the true motivation was to help these kids or not. I certainly think there was a lot of nationalism and wanting to be first. He Jiankui, who was the scientist, again, who led this, it wasn't like he was some brilliant pioneer who was so far ahead of everybody else. There were tens of thousands of people who could have been first in doing what he did. So his big pioneering was just ethical pioneering, that he was willing to take risks on humans that other people would have found abhorrent or unethical, and he did it in a totally untransparent way. He actually hid a lot of information. He didn't draw on the best resources available to make sure this was done safely. Certainly, had he not done it, it would have been done, however many years, 5, 10 years later. But it could have been done in a much better way. It could have been done with a smarter target. I mean, what he was trying to do was give these babies who wouldn't be born with HIV, they had HIV positive fathers, a slightly increased resistance to HIV in the future. So it's a very, very marginal gain for those children that comes with just a massive potential risk. And so what for? And that's why it was so unethical. It's not that it was done at all. It was that it was done then and in such a transparent and just terrible way.
And wasn't there something about like a shorter lifespan or something that could be a possibility?
Well, nobody knows. Nobody knows. I mean, certainly in some there were the 1 or 2 studies. Exactly. That's the thing, and that's why it's human experimentation. There's nothing wrong with being first, and being first with anything involves taking some kind of risk, but we need to manage those risks. And if the goal is just to be first, come hell or high water, then that's when it becomes more dangerous.
For the people that are out there experimenting on themselves, I mean, there's this guy Josiah Zahner. He's got the Odin, and he's putting the ability into, however many people's hands he can in their garage to essentially use CRISPR on themselves. Does that technology allow people to do a gene drive and pass those changes to their offspring?
Not a gene drive, certainly not for humans, and I don't think that's what he's trying to do. And I certainly am supportive of the DIY bio movement because we know there were all the people in the early days of the computer era and people like Steve Wozniak and others who seemed like oddballs and kooks, but actually drove some real creativity forward, and the possibility that they created has actually helped a lot of people. So I certainly am supportive of the DIY bio movement, but that doesn't mean that I support every application. And so I think when we talk about systemic changes to a human, especially in areas where we don't fully understand how the systems work, I think there's a real need to be prudent, to be careful, to be cautious. And we need governments to help regulate that environment. I mean, we wouldn't allow people to sell drugs or pharmaceuticals that had a 50% or whatever percent chance of harming people. We regulate those things because not everybody has perfect information. As a matter of fact, most people don't. And so if Josiah Zayner or can't remember the name of these guys who were trying to sell treatments and are doing these kinds of gonzo interventions, I think it should be regulated. What we're talking about is the future of life, about people's health and well-being. And it shouldn't be that everybody does whatever they want, and maybe if people, it's hard to stop people from doing things to themselves, but you certainly, when we do, stop people from pushing drugs on others, from selling pharmaceutical products that are dangerous, from doing surgeries on people that when people don't need it, and we should be regulating this the DIY bio world just to protect people, but we shouldn't do it in a way that squashes what we want, which is growth and creativity.
Right. So I guess I wanted some clarification on the. So can you really not do gene drive on adults? Does something like that have to start in the embryo? Can you ever...
Well, so I think you're confusing a few different things. So certainly you could do, so what is a gene drive? A gene drive is when you insert the gene with the mechanism for its own self-perpetuation. To do it in a human, the only way to do it would be genetically engineering their sex cells, so the sperm, eggs, or embryo. So if you did it in an adult, you wouldn't target any part of the adult other than the sperm or the eggs of that adult. Is it possible? So, but I just think that so it's two different things. Gene drive certainly for mosquitoes and flies. There's a lot that's happening.
I have this fantastical vision that people will be able to use genetic engineering to like change adults, like even go as far as like change their body structure, change their skin color, change their sex. Is that kind of thing possible in a grown adult?
Certainly, changing sex, changing body structure, that people can do that on their own. Just eat Fritos all day. But in terms of, so certainly for those bigger things, I mean that it's certainly not now, not for many decades. When you, over the course of life, you have all of your cells specialize and you become you. And it's much more difficult once you're formed to go back in evolutionary time and then to change you into something else. But having said that, if you did relatively simple interventions, because we have certain kinds of people, for example, have single gene mutations that allow them to build muscle mass. And so is it possible that people could have some kind of gene therapy to either give them that one mutation or to have some other kinds of intervention so that their body is producing proteins as if they had that mutation? That certainly is possible, because skin color is relatively simple. I think that's one where I could imagine that at some point in the future, certainly not now. I don't know who would want such a thing, but so I do think that we're going to be able to have different kinds of interventions, and some of them are going to be for health and improving people's health, but others are going to be toward what people now consider enhancement, but our definition of what is and isn't enhancement exists within a cultural context that will change over time.
My show is all sort of about this fantastical future that's a little bit more further looking than I think what most people think of. They want to know, what is this? How is this going to affect me 5 years from now or 10 years from now? And I'm like, well, what about 50 years from now? When we're needing to engineer people to survive on Mars or something along those lines. Will that kind of stuff be able to be engineered into living adults, or are we going to have to make that decision of, hey, we need a population on Mars, let's start engineering sex cells?
Yeah, so the question is, how much intervention do we need? So using the example of traveling to Mars, one of the biggest problems in doing it will be the increased exposure to radiation. And our bodies are essentially what our bodies are replication machines, which is why our cells keep replacing themselves. And every time the genetic information in a cell is copied, there can be little tiny errors. And when you are younger, your body does a better job of correcting those errors than when you're older. So for sure, there will be interventions that will make people more resistant to that kind of radiation. And then there'll be, I'm sure, other kinds of protections that will make those changes more possible. The more radical the change, the more important it's going to be is to do it earlier in life, because we have greatest plasticity in the beginning, and that decreases over time. But what we're talking about is life, and whatever your theology, life is sacred. And so we can imagine, and I certainly do, and I write all about these issues in Hacking Darwin. But we can't be glib about it. We need to recognize that there are real serious trade-offs, and we may have to
That's going to be
genetically.
tough for me.
Well, no, well, we may have to genetically alter. We will have to genetically alter our future generations if they're to survive in space. And we know that our planet is time limited, and if we want our species to survive, we have to do it elsewhere. We've evolved to live on the surface of this planet, which is why we have a hard time when either we're at the bottom of the sea or at the top of Mount Everest. And if we want to be different, we're going to have to make those changes. And there are certain people, for example, Tibetans and others, who are genetically more suited to altitude. And so we know that there are even small changes that can increase our capacity to thrive in a particular environment.
And just, a prediction, do you think you might live to see the day where you'd reach longevity escape velocity, so where they cure aging or even be able to make you grow younger, in your lifetime?
So when people talk about longevity escape velocity, and I write about it in the book, if I don't think it's possible for humans in this physical form to live forever. In part, it's just, even if you live a little longer, the longer you live, the more the law of averages is going to catch up with you, and you'll probably die of something that you never would have imagined, like a rabid penguin or something. But I do think that we'll continue to chip away, as we've done for certainly the last century, at average lifespan and hopefully average health span. And that we're not going to live forever, but we certainly, I believe, can live healthier longer, and we should aspire to do that.
So what do you think is the biggest threat right now, AI or biotech?
So I wouldn't say that either of them are a threat, but both of them are technologies that have incredible potential to help us that could be abused. And so I think it's healthy to not think of them as threats, but to say that, well, how do we make sure that we're minimizing any potential harms? And that it involves thinking deeply about issues of governance and regulation and education and all of those things.
But if you had to choose one,
I just think that it's, they're both, I think, fantastic. They're connected, because the AI revolution is what makes the biotech revolution possible. But for anything you can imagine, nightmare scenarios. And so I just think that it's, we can picture great stories and terrible stories for any technology.
What's your best case scenario for let's say 10 years from now? Because things keep happening faster than we think they're going to happen. So a prediction for 10 years from now might, some people might think that won't happen for 50 years. What do you think?
In any category?
No, for biotech.
Oh, I think within 10 years, we'll certainly be able to prevent and treat lots more diseases. We're going to shift from our world of generalized healthcare based on population averages to precision, personalized healthcare based on each person's individual biology, to predictive medicine healthcare and health and life, ultimately, where we're going to have a lot of information and increasingly more information about how our lives might potentially play out, both in terms of risks and opportunities. And that will allow us to think a little bit differently. If we have a risk, say, of developing type 2 diabetes or a genetic form of breast cancer, we may choose to behave in certain ways, to interact with the healthcare system in certain ways, to get tested more regularly and earlier. And if we find out that we have a real potential to be, for example, a great sprinter, that may give us a little boost to try out things where we know that at least it appears that we have a genetic possibility of being outstanding.
Any companies that you're following closely right now that you're most excited about?
I mean, there's lots of companies in this sector and this broad sector on everything in diagnostics and analysis. There are great companies, not just the bigger ones like Illumina, but lots of smaller companies that are working on things like liquid biopsies and other analytics. There are lots of we're seeing with the COVID vaccines. There are new ways of intervening to enhance people's health and to give people protection. There are lots of great companies there. There are lots of great companies in cellular agriculture, thinking differently about resources for manufacturing. So there's really a lot, and this is a tide that is rising. And so I certainly, for people interested in investing, what I always say is make a big, broad bet on the sector, and then you'll for sure win.
I was thinking specifically of companies like Twist and Moderna and Tessera. Have you heard of Tessera's technology?
No.
Because CRISPR just sort of like edits out. It cuts out the gene. It's great for specific gene mutations, but it doesn't actually write code in. Is that correct?
So these are the base. We were talking about the companies doing base and prime editing. Is that right? So CRISPR does a double-stranded cut of DNA, which is not necessarily great for even addressing single gene mutations. It's very aggressive. There are new approaches, base editing and prime editing, that identify what you want to change, and they either disrupt or rewrite the code. I think that's what you're referring to. And certainly those are very promising. You mentioned Twist. Companies like Twist and Ginkgo are great, but there are a lot of really great companies. It's a very exciting sector.
Yeah, I'm excited about Tessera. They identified something called mobile genetic elements that are different from the what's used in CRISPR and Cas9 that are made to write in the code. So I was unaware that they had CRISPR technology that would actually write in code. That's exciting, because I think that's a lot more exciting than just being able to cut out the part. Thanks for doing this.
Sure.
I wanted to plug your foundation, and obviously everybody needs to read Hacking Darwin. I read it.
Good.
Great.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. Yeah. Well, that's great. So Hacking Darwin, people are welcome to go to hackingdarwin.com website. And with One Shared World, we're trying to ask, can we create a framework for solving our biggest problem, which is that we have global problems, but we don't have a way of solving them. Global problems, but no global solutions. And so we see with climate change, pandemics, and so many other things that we can't come together to do the big things. And we're trying to imagine, not just imagine how we can change that, but start building toward that world. Oneshared.world.
Yeah, this kind of news is it's a lot more uplifting. I mean, there can be scary parts of it, but it's very exciting. This future that's coming in. So thank you anyway for sharing your knowledge on this subject.
My pleasure.
Great to have you. Thanks.
Thanks, Emmett. My great pleasure. Take care.